the gentle hush of the morning, as the golden rays began to shimmer on the surface of the Sea of Galilee, the world moved as it always had. Fishermen were busy with their nets, casting, pulling, cleaning and mending, tasks they had done countless times before. The smell of salt water mingled with the scent of damp rope and fresh fish. It was routine, predictable. These were men who understood hard work, who measured time not by the clock, but by the rhythm of tides and the weight of their catch. Nothing about that day seemed unusual. It was just another morning. Until he came walking by. There were no trumpets, no crowd following, no flash of lightning or sound from the sky. Just a man walking along the shore with a presence that defied explanation. He didn't come with authority robes or religious symbols. He didn't speak like a ruler, yet he carried the quiet confidence of one who truly sees. His steps were calm, yet purposeful, as if every inch of the path he took was sacred. His eyes met theirs, not with judgment, but with understanding. Deep, searching, and filled with something eternal. Then he spoke. He didn't give a sermon, he didn't quote long scrolls or debate theology. He said something so simple, so direct, and yet so deeply piercing that it would echo through the corridors of time. Follow me? That was it. Just those two words. And in that moment, everything changed. These fishermen, who had probably planned to spend their entire lives on that same stretch of water, suddenly felt something stir inside them, something that no net had ever caught before. The most astonishing part of this moment wasn't just what Jesus said, it was when and where he said it. He didn't call them in a temple during prayer. He didn't find them at a spiritual retreat or during a moment of deep reflection. He came to them while they were working, busy with their daily responsibilities, soaked in sweat and burdened with exhaustion. It wasn't a holy setting, but an ordinary one. That detail alone speaks volumes. It tells us that divine moments are not always wrapped in ritual. Sometimes, the most sacred invitations come during the most mundane tasks. This moment on the shore teaches that the extraordinary often begins in the ordinary. These men were not praying for a sign. They were not preparing themselves to be used by God. They weren't dressed in robes or fasting in the wilderness. They were doing what they did every day, making a living. Yet, in that moment, heaven touched earth. Without warning, without a checklist, without qualification, it was the sacredness of the ordinary being interrupted by divine purpose. This wasn't a planned religious encounter. There was no build-up, no ceremony, and that is what makes it so beautiful. It reveals that God meets people where they are, not where they pretend to be. He doesn't wait for perfection or performance. He walks into real lives with real struggles and offers a real invitation. And that's what happened that day on the shore. Jesus called them as they were, in the middle of their real life, and that call carried eternal weight. The fact that this moment happened in the ordinary setting of a workday speaks directly to the rest of humanity. It removes the idea that spiritual significance can only come in temples or during rituals. It shows that the divine often enters our lives in places we least expect, in the middle of traffic, during a long shift, in the quiet of a grocery aisle, or while rocking a child to sleep. Holiness is not confined to sacred spaces. It walks into the dust and sweat of everyday life and speaks with clarity. There was no warning, no flash of miracles beforehand, just a call. Timeless and piercing, follow me. And something deep within those fishermen recognized that voice. It wasn't just sound. It was calling them out of survival and into purpose. They didn't need to prepare for it. They just needed to listen. And in listening, they found everything. What happened on that shore was more than a moment. It was the beginning of a transformation. It was a revelation that greatness often begins unnoticed, in the simplicity of obedience to a quiet call during an ordinary day. He stood at the edge of the lake where the cool breeze met the warmth of the early sun and looked out at the men before him. They were just finishing their work, muscles sore, hands stained with the memory of labor, eyes tired from the night. These were not scholars or priests. They were not men of position or power. They were fishermen, ordinary, rough-handed, sunburnt men whose lives were shaped by the ebb and flow of the waters they worked. No one expected them to change the world. No one, except the one who stood before them with a calm and unwavering gaze. He did not see what the world saw. He did not see just their profession, their social rank, or their limitations. He saw their potential. He saw hearts that could be shaped, lives that could be transformed. He saw in them what no one else had ever noticed: a willingness to drop everything for truth. He didn't walk into synagogues searching for the most educated. He didn't approach kings or wealthy merchants. He didn't call the eloquent or the powerful. He walked among the humble, among the unnoticed. He walked toward those who smelled of fish and sweat and seaweed. And he spoke to them with a voice full of authority, yet gentleness. He did not need to persuade with long arguments or convince with promises of reward. His words carried weight because they were rooted in truth. And when he said, "Follow me," he was speaking not just to ears, but to the depths of their souls. These were men who had never been invited to anything greater than another day's labor. Now, they were being called into eternity. It was a choice he made deliberately. He did not choose based on status, wealth, or education. He chose based on heart. He chose those who knew how to endure long nights and how to keep casting nets even when nothing came in. He chose resilience. He chose faithfulness in the unseen. He chose teachable spirits, not hardened pride. The men he called had no illusions of greatness. They didn't see themselves as leaders or voices of the future, yet those were the very men he invited into his inner circle. Because what he was building was not of this world. It would not be built on political strategy or religious hierarchy. It would be built on transformed hearts, on humility, on obedience, and he found what he was looking for on that shore. What made the calling even more extraordinary was how quickly they responded, without negotiation, without delay, without asking for time to think. There was no contract, no benefits, no clear direction. All they had was a voice and a presence that felt more real than anything they had ever known. And they followed. They left their nets, their boats, their security, and their identity. In an instant, they exchanged the known for the unknown. They did not need to see the future to obey in the present. It was not logic that led them, it was faith. Faith that didn't have all the answers. Faith that moved not from certainty, but from trust. Their response reveals the power of that call. It wasn't just a command, it was an awakening. Something inside them recognized that this was not an ordinary man, and this was not an ordinary moment. They weren't following a rabbi or a teacher in the traditional sense. They were following someone whose very being radiated truth, someone whose eyes held eternity. And for the first time, perhaps in their entire lives, they were seen not just for who they were, but for who they could become. That recognition broke through fear, doubt, and hesitation, and it stirred in them a courage they didn't know they had. This kind of faith is rare. It's not based on evidence, but on encounter. It does not demand a blueprint, it responds to a voice. When they heard those words, "Follow me," it was as though time paused. The boat, the nets, the fish, everything they had ever known, faded in significance, because something greater had entered their world. They followed, not because they had figured everything out, but because deep inside, they knew they were meant for more. Something eternal had brushed against the ordinary, and they answered. They walked away not just from their profession, but from their past, and they began a journey that would echo far beyond the shores of Galilee. The moment his voice rang out over the sound of the waves, something ancient stirred in their hearts. The call was clear and simple: follow me. It wasn't accompanied by promises of fame or fortune. There was no detailed plan, no contract laid out, no assurance of what would happen next. Yet the response was instant. These men, hardened by years of physical labor and shaped by the routine of life, did not pause to weigh their options. They didn't consult with family or count the cost. They left their nets. Just like that. The very tools of their trade, the foundation of their livelihood, the instruments that connected them to their past and secured their future, they dropped them without hesitation. There's something deeply powerful in this immediate surrender. It wasn't impulsiveness or recklessness, it was clarity. In that moment, they understood that what stood before them was greater than anything they had ever known. The call didn't need explanation because it spoke directly to their spirits, not just their minds. It awakened something inside them that had long been asleep. The nets they had clung to for survival became meaningless in the presence of this new purpose. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't demand a guarantee. They simply obeyed. This act of surrender was not easy. The nets represented more than just work. They symbolized identity, security, and control. To walk away from them was to step into the unknown, to embrace vulnerability, to relinquish everything familiar. But that's what they did. The simplicity of their action revealed the depth of their trust. They gave up comfort without knowing what they would receive in return. That kind of obedience isn't born from logic. It comes from faith. It's the kind of faith that responds immediately, not because it knows the destination, but because it trusts the one who calls. They walked away not just from possessions, but from predictability. The life of a fisherman, though hard, was at least known. They understood the sea, the patterns of fish, the seasons of abundance and scarcity. But following him meant letting go of everything they could control. There was no map, no daily schedule, just the assurance of his presence. That was enough. The moment they dropped their nets was more than a physical act. It was a spiritual declaration. It was the moment they said, with their actions, that they believed there was something more worth pursuing than survival or success. That kind of surrender stands in contrast to the world's idea of following. Today, many follow only when it's convenient, when the outcome is clear, or when the benefits are guaranteed. But this was not that kind of following. This was absolute. It required letting go of everything, without proof, without reward, and without delay. It required them to trust not in a system, but in a person. And that person didn't offer comfort. He offered transformation. When they left their nets, they weren't just walking away from fishing. They were walking away from self-dependence. They were walking away from everything that had defined their past. The sea, the catch, the trade. All of it stayed behind on the shore. What lay ahead was not success in the world's terms, but an entirely different kind of mission. A mission that would take them through storms, across cities, into prisons, and eventually to their own moments of sacrifice. But in that first act of obedience, they showed that they were ready for it all. Their surrender is what set the foundation for everything that followed. They didn't ease into discipleship, they jumped into it with both feet. There was no testing phase, no trial period, just one decision made in a moment of divine clarity, and their lives were never the same. Their obedience became the doorway through which heaven began to touch earth in a new way. And it all started with a simple but profound act: letting go of the nets and stepping into the unknown. He didn't climb the temple stairs or knock at the doors of religious scholars. He didn't approach scribes with years of study or Pharisees with deep knowledge of the law. He did not stand before the powerful or the rich, nor did he seek those with influence over crowds. He walked instead to the shoreline, where laborers toiled in silence, where the hands of fishermen bled from rope and wood, where the air smelled of fish and sweat. It was there, not in places of status, that he chose his first followers. It was among the ordinary, the overlooked, and the rough that he saw something extraordinary waiting to be awakened. The world may have passed by these men without a second glance. They weren't educated or articulate. They didn't carry scrolls or wear fine garments. They weren't trained in theology or known for spiritual insight. They were men of simple lives and heavy burdens. But he saw past all of that. He saw through the dirt on their hands and the tiredness in their eyes. He saw hearts ready to be molded, loyalty waiting to be tested, and courage that had yet to rise. His eyes did not look for titles or achievements. They searched for willingness. And in those rugged fishermen, he found more than enough. What made these men the right choice wasn't what they had achieved, it was what they were willing to become. The sea had taught them endurance. The long nights had trained them in patience. Failure was no stranger to them, yet they returned to their work each morning. This resilience, this quiet strength born of struggle, was exactly what he needed. He didn't need perfection. He needed devotion. He didn't need skill. He needed surrender. And surrender, though hidden behind calloused hands and weathered skin, was alive in them. By choosing them, he shattered every expectation of what leadership looked like. The religious elite may have expected the Messiah to align with their structure, to validate their authority and choose from their ranks. But he did the opposite. He walked around the religious center of society and made his way to the margins. His message wasn't just in what he said, it was in who he chose. Every step he took toward those men was a declaration that the kingdom of heaven does not operate according to earthly standards. It does not favor the proud or the privileged. It searches for those humble enough to follow and brave enough to change. His decision to call fishermen first was not random. They were men who knew how to face the unpredictable. Storms on the water had taught them how to react with calm. The silence of waiting for a catch had taught them how to endure disappointment. They were not easily discouraged, and this journey they were about to begin would require more than knowledge. It would demand faith in the faith of the unknown. It would demand obedience when the road became dark and dangerous. He needed men who had been tested by life, not sheltered from it. The simplicity of their background also made them more ready to receive. They had no reputation to protect, no pride in position to defend. They weren't entangled in the systems of power or bound by the fear of losing status. When he spoke, they didn't argue or debate. They didn't ask whether it would be worth their time. Their lack of religious education did not make them less useful. In fact, it made them more open. Their minds were not filled with layers of tradition. They were ready to be shaped from the ground up by truth. He chose them to show the world that grace can reach anyone, anywhere. That a new beginning is possible, not just in holy places, but in the dust and grit of daily life. By walking past the proud and calling the humble, he reminded humanity that no one is too small for greatness in the eyes of God. It was a lesson not only for them, but for generations to come. That the creator of the universe looks at the heart, not the image. That he calls not those who think they are worthy, but those willing to walk in obedience, no matter where it leads. When the call was spoken, "Follow me," there was no elaborate explanation attached. No itinerary was handed to them, no destination was disclosed, there were no guarantees about food, shelter, safety, or success. The future was a blank page, and yet they stepped into it willingly. They didn't stop to ask where they would be taken, or how long it would last. There was no pause to negotiate terms. It wasn't because they were careless or naive. It was because something about that voice, that presence, carried a weight that silenced all questions. They followed not with a full understanding of the road ahead, but with a deep inner conviction that the one who called them was worthy of their trust. It's natural for people to want clarity before commitment. Most hesitate without knowing the outcome. They want direction, a plan, a sense of control before they move. But this call shattered that logic. It didn't appeal to the intellect. It wasn't a reasoned proposal. It was a direct summons that bypassed the mind and went straight to the soul. And their response proved that sometimes truth doesn't need to be explained to be believed. It only needs to be heard. The power of the call was not in its logic, but in its authority. It was a voice that carried eternity within it, and when it spoke, it awakened something ancient in them that had long been dormant. There was no assurance of safety, no promise of comfort, no appeal to reward. Everything that would normally be required to make a rational decision was absent. And yet, they responded with absolute obedience. That kind of faith is not common. It isn't the kind of faith that's learned from books or inherited from tradition. It is the kind that emerges only when a soul recognizes the presence of something greater than itself. These men had nothing to gain, at least not in the visible sense. They didn't know that their names would be remembered for centuries, or that their steps would lay the foundation for a movement that would spread across the world. All they knew in that moment was that they were being called, and that the one calling them was worth following. Faith like that is rare because it requires surrender without certainty. It means giving up control without a promise of return. Most people want to see the whole path before taking the first step. But the kind of faith shown by these fishermen defied that mindset. It took only one moment, one encounter, for them to leave behind everything they knew. They did not need to see what was ahead. They only needed to hear the voice. And that voice was enough to break their attachment to the known and lead them into the unknown. It's easy to have faith when things are clear, when results are guaranteed, when risk is low. But the faith they demonstrated had no such comforts. It was immediate, raw, and total. It said, yes, before knowing the cost. It trusted before it understood. That kind of trust cannot be manufactured. It cannot be taught through theory. It is born from an encounter with truth so overwhelming that it strips away every fear and every excuse. When the eternal touches the ordinary, hesitation fades, and surrender becomes the only possible response. So this obedience was not passive, it was powerful. It was not weak submission, but courageous decision. They didn't follow because they had to. They followed because they wanted to. Because something in them knew that life would never be the same if they said no. They had fished all their lives relying on skill, timing, and nature. But in that moment, they realized they were being invited into something far deeper than a career shift. They were being asked to trust with no proof, to believe without seeing. Such faith is a mirror to the soul. It reveals what we truly value. These men valued the caller more than the catch. They valued obedience more than certainty. And their story became one of the greatest examples in history of what it looks like to walk by faith and not by sight. Their obedience wasn't about understanding the call. It was about trusting the one who gave it. And in that trust, everything changed. It began with a single moment. One man walking along a quiet shore, looking into the eyes of working men and calling them into something beyond comprehension. The words were simple, but the impact was timeless. That single act of following would become the spark of a movement so profound it would reshape the world and echo through every generation. The decision to follow wasn't just personal. It became the first step in a spiritual revolution. What began on a beach in Galilee grew into a wave that would sweep across nations, cultures, languages, and centuries, not through violence or political power, but through love, sacrifice, and transformation of the heart. They did not know in that moment of obedience that they were stepping into history. They had no idea that their decision to drop their nets would one day lead to healing the sick, raising the dead, speaking truth before kings, and facing persecution with unwavering courage. Yet it all started so quietly, with no crowds, no fanfare, and no applause. That is the paradox of divine beginnings. They appear small, even invisible to the world, but they carry within them the seeds of eternal change. The call wasn't just about the men, it was about the world that would be reached through them. This revolution did not need swords. It did not need armies. It did not need political strategy or military conquest. It began in hearts, took root in lives, and grew through one act of obedience after another. These disciples would walk through dusty roads, sleep under open skies, endure hunger and hostility, and still speak of love, mercy, and forgiveness. They would learn to lead not through dominance, but through humility. They would learn that power is not about control, but about service. And through that service, they would show a broken world a better way. The message they carried was not one of revenge or resistance. It was one of redemption. The revolution Jesus began with those first disciples was unlike anything the world had seen. It turned the values of the earth upside down, where the least became the greatest, where the weak were chosen to shame the strong, where love for enemies replaced hatred, and where dying for the truth was considered victory, not defeat. These ideas were not just radical, they were dangerous to the systems of power because they offered freedom that could not be controlled. In a world ruled by empires and hierarchies, Jesus' approach was astonishing. He called a few unimportant men, taught them, walked with them, corrected them, empowered them, and then entrusted them with the greatest mission of all time. They were not perfect. They stumbled, they doubted, they failed. Yet he never gave up on them. He saw what they could become, and he patiently shaped them until they were ready to carry the fire of the message into every corner of the world. What started with a few would eventually reach millions. This spiritual revolution has outlived empires, survived persecution, crossed continents, and endured for over 2,000 years. Its strength was never in numbers or wealth, but in the transformation of the human heart. It is a movement fueled not by the ambition of man, but by the power of love. It was never meant to be a religion of buildings and rituals alone, but a living relationship between the Creator and those who dare to say yes to His call. And all of it traces back to that moment on the shore, a moment when ordinary men left everything behind to follow a voice they barely understood but wholly trusted. A moment that proved revolutions don't always start with crowds or chaos. Sometimes they begin in silence, with a call, a response, and a heart willing to follow. What they began in that moment became a force greater than any government, outlasting any kingdom. shaping hearts long after their footsteps faded from the earth. The impact of that initial calling did not stay contained in Galilee. It reached Rome, Africa, Asia and beyond. It entered prisons, palaces, deserts and cities. It changed how people viewed life, death, suffering, purpose and love. All because a few chose to follow without understanding, to walk without knowing, and to believe without seeing. They didn't just follow a man, they followed a message, a mission, and a calling that would forever change the course of human history. The words spoken on that quiet shoreline didn't vanish with the wind. They were not meant solely for the ears of the fishermen who heard them first. The call, "Follow me," was not limited by time or geography. It wasn't a moment confined to the past. It was the beginning of something eternal. That voice still echoes, still calls, still stirs hearts across every generation. The same invitation given to those fishermen continues to be extended to people everywhere, in every culture, in every stage of life. It wasn't a one-time event. It is a living call, moving through history, reaching into the lives of those who are willing to listen and respond. The voice does not always come with thunder or fire. It often comes in silence, in the still moments between distraction and duty, when a heart becomes quiet enough to hear something deeper. It may come in the midst of a crisis or during routine. It may arise as a whisper in the conscience, a deep stirring in the soul, or a sudden awareness that life must be more than survival. The call is not always loud, but it is always present. It does not force its way into a life. It waits. It invites. It beckons. And like those first disciples, the listener must decide, immediately or eventually, whether to follow. This calling does not require perfection. It does not seek those who have figured everything out. It doesn't ask for resumes, degrees, titles, or good behavior. It asks for willingness. The same way it called out to those simple men by the sea, it reaches out today to the broken, the doubting, the ordinary. It calls the successful and the struggling alike. It does not see how far someone has drifted, only how ready they are to return. It does not measure potential the way the world does. It looks past appearances and reaches for the heart. It's easy to believe that those called must be special, gifted, holy, or somehow more worthy. But that belief is exactly what the call defies. The original disciples were not extraordinary men. They became extraordinary because they followed. They didn't have the qualifications before they answered. The qualifications came through the journey. The voice that called them is the same one calling now. It sees what others cannot see. It knows what lies within the human soul, even when the soul itself has forgotten. It knows how to heal, how to restore, how to awaken purpose where there once was only pain. Even today, people are being called not just to believe, but to follow, to leave behind more than just old habits, but entire mindsets, to let go of fear, of control, of self-reliance, and to walk forward in trust. The call challenges comfort. It disrupts patterns. It invites risk. It doesn't guarantee ease, but it promises transformation. Those who respond may not know where the path leads, but they know who leads the path, and that knowing changes everything. There are no age limits to this calling. It finds the young in their passion and the old in their wisdom. It finds the seeker and the skeptic, the strong and the weak. It calls in every language, in every land, across every barrier humanity has ever built. Its power lies not in volume, but in truth. It resonates because it was spoken from eternity, and eternity recognizes its own. It is the same call that turned fishermen into messengers, cowards into martyrs, and doubters into believers. It is the same call that continues to build a kingdom not made of stone, but of hearts surrendered. The call will not always be convenient. It may come when life is full, when plans are set, when dreams are within reach. It may interrupt goals, shake expectations, and challenge everything familiar. But it always comes with purpose. And to those who hear it and respond, life becomes more than existence. It becomes mission. The story of the first disciples wasn't just theirs. It was the beginning of a pattern. Their response was not just obedience. It was prophecy. It showed what would come for all those willing to say yes in their own time, in their own way. The call that began with a man walking along the shores of Galilee still moves through time like wind through trees, unseen but undeniable. It finds people where they are, not where they think they should be. It invites them, just as they are, into something more than they ever thought possible. And every time someone says yes, the legacy continues, not as history repeated, but as eternity unfolding in the present moment. Following him was never a decision of comfort. From the very beginning, the call was not wrapped in safety, luxury, or ease. It was a call into the unknown, into challenge, into a life of surrender. The men who stood on that shore and left their nets behind weren't stepping into success as the world defines it. They were stepping into sacrifice. They were letting go of stability, predictability, and everything they had built their lives upon. It wasn't just the act of walking away from a job, it was the inward tearing of old identities, the death of control, and the willingness to carry burdens they couldn't yet see. The invitation to follow came at a cost, and it still does. There were no promises of shelter each night, no plans for income, no assurance that friends or family would understand. In fact, rejection was more likely than acceptance. The journey would not be smooth. There would be storms both on the sea and in the soul. There would be days of hunger and nights of fear. They would encounter crowds full of admiration and mobs full of hatred. They would be misunderstood, accused, and eventually hunted. The road ahead was not one of prestige, but of pain. And yet, they chose it willingly. He never hid the truth from them. He spoke of taking up crosses, of being hated for his name, of losing one's life to find it. These weren't metaphors designed to scare. They were the reality of what it meant to walk with him. To follow meant to die, first to self, then if necessary in body. It was a path that stripped away everything false, the approval of others, the security of wealth, the illusion of control. All of it would be surrendered along, but what remained was real. What remained was unshakable. The world defines comfort as the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure. But following him redefines everything. It teaches that joy can be found in suffering, peace in storms, strength in weakness. The disciples would come to learn this not through theory, but through experience. They would walk through rejection and betrayal and still find purpose. They would be beaten, imprisoned, mocked, and eventually killed, but never destroyed. Because what they had gained in exchange for comfort was something eternal, something that could not be bought or earned, only received by surrender. This journey wasn't one they took alone. The road was hard, but he walked it with them. Through deserts, through villages, across rivers, and into cities, he never sent them where he hadn't gone first. He led by example. He knelt to wash their feet. He prayed when they slept. He fed them when they hungered, and forgave them when they failed. He didn't call them into hardship and stand far off. He stepped into it with them, and that is what gave them courage. Not the promise of an easy life, but the presence of the one who called them. The transformation that happened in them was not sudden, but steady. It came through brokenness. It came through long days of confusion and long nights of prayer. It came through mistakes, rebukes, and moments when they wanted to quit. But with every trial, something inside them grew stronger. Their faith deepened, their love sharpened. Their hearts became more like his, and eventually they came to understand that following him wasn't about where he led them, it was about who they became in the process. The cost of discipleship didn't decrease with time, it increased, but so did the reward. Not in material wealth, but in unshakable purpose. Not in popularity, but in divine intimacy. Not in comfort, but in character. They became men who could stand in front of angry crowds and speak with peace. Men who could be chained in prison and still sing. Men who could give their lives away and count it as gain. The path had not been easy, but it had been worth everything. Even now, that same path is open, but it does not promise safety. It does not promise success. It promises transformation, and the first step is still the same. The willingness to leave behind comfort, to abandon control, and to follow, not because the road is easy, but because the one who leads it is worthy.